Okay, so I was talking to AI about evolution, Darwinian evolution, and I was trying to get to understand that there are some examples in nature that the very idea that it had evolved um, is bizarre and kind of stupid, and it didn't evolve in the way that it is now by stages, by some sort of mal malformity, and then that gets added to the you know. So I was trying to get an AI to understand an argument, and it finally did. Yeah, after a long time, yeah, it seems to like put out the very commonly understood crap, and then you can get to the less commonly thought of crap. And so I went through this whole thing, and I was trying to get to see if the AI could consider that evolution is wrong. It has a hard time considering that it's wrong because it's such a popular theory. However, um, it's not right. And so, one way to do that is to point out various species that the very structure of continuing down an evolutionary path would kill it or make it very difficult for it to reproduce. So I asked it in various different ways. The one example I used is called the Rita Marbile in drafts. It's referring to me, so that's kind of funny. But it's a little tiny, like a heart valve in the neck of a giraffe, and there's six of them in a row. And I was trying to get it to understand that a human would say, okay, so imagine the various steps of that. It starts out as a lump. Lumps very rarely get passed on if it's a malformation. It rarely get passed on to a DNA. But let's say it's a lump that gets passed on. Now, lumps in a blood vessel controlling the blood of the vein um, rarely turn positive. It would seem like it would be totally outside the idea of possibilities. So it's uniquely adapted to like not let blood go backwards, so that the giraffe goes to drink water, has to open its legs, and it gets its head down. And if it didn't have those valves, it would pass out and get eaten. Um, but my point was is that okay, so you have the first species. It's like the problem with a lot of these theories is they don't really look at the in between idea. A species that looks like a little horse and has a slightly longer neck. Okay, so it can eat leaves. So they said that's the evolutionary advantage. But it has a lump in its neck, and that lump doesn't kill it, or doesn't kill many generations later, because it has to get big and become a valve. And so this valve evolves through many generations of this species continuing to have an advantage because it can eat leaves. Well, at that point, it's not an advantage anyway, because it doesn't need to have that long of a neck to eat leaves. So that advantage is actually a bit wrong. And so a logical person would say, no, I see what you're saying. For that to then happen six times to get passed on to its future generations, when it's not, it wouldn't be an advantage to have a long neck for many, many generations. It just seems like it's mathematically wrong. So that was one of the examples I was just trying to see. And so I asked the blunt question, is like, there any species where the in-between stages would be more likely to kill it than to be an advantage? Okay, so another one that's unlikely is called the bombarder beetle. It's a beetle that has two active chemicals in its abdomen. It puts them together and shoots it out at predators. And that's very much been questioned whether it could have been like evolved in stages. It would be very problematic if it's by its evolving, those two chemicals mixed and they become like a toxic spray. So that's another one that's really kind of unlikely to happen by accident or by stages of evolution, and that's very much questioned by scientists too. You can go you can go back in the life stream that they think is what happened. That life started as these little things and became eventually water creatures, and the water creatures crawled up onto land. And again, they don't look at the in-between structures. Why would a water creature have anything that could be like a lung? And so the creature goes up on the land and dies. Now, there are creatures now that have both capabilities, but you would assume that if it's Darwinian, if it's some sort of long ago, millions, billions of years ago kind of process, then that creature would crawl up and just like perish. It wouldn't have just developed by accident in stages some sort of lung structure. And the other one that's used is the human eye. Eyes in general, like you're in a molten sea, and how would seeing a spark somewhere, if not the sun or whatever, be an advantage? How does that happen individually by accident? How does that malformity move into the species, and how would that malformity become so complex, like the human eye or any eye, for example? Okay, so the woodpecker bird, it pecks on a tree and it bores a hole, puts food in it, and then it has a very, very specific, very highly structured shock absorber in it between its beak and its brain, and it keeps it from knocking itself unconscious. Seems like a very unrealistic to believe that happened in stages, or that it was passed on as an advantage to its offspring. And basically, the in-between stages would mean that the woodpecker would knock itself out and probably be eaten. So that really has a very high high probability of not being evolved in stages of Darwinian, in the Darwinian sense. Okay, so this next one I came up with myself, actually. I was sitting on a hill with my family, and these fireflies came up. And I'm thinking to myself, that Darwinian evolution, it doesn't think of the in-between processes and what it goes from what it started to what it would have to end as. And so it floats up, and they say, well, it keeps predators from eating it. But if the predator had never eaten it, it would not know not to eat it. So you would assume that the first ones that glowed in the dark would be instantly eaten, and even if it just they did, even if they don't taste good. So it's a combination of chemicals that creates almost no heat. It's extremely complex, and some have trouble understanding that it probably was not evolved in stages. That its survival would have been limited quite readily. They're beautiful little things when you see them floating up. The other one was reproduction. Well, how does the first one know that means reproduction? So it's just like it's like having ABC logic, and Darwinian evolution has an A and have a C, but they don't have the B. They don't have the middle part of the logic, and I find that very interesting. Anybody would believe that. Another one that's listed as highly unlikely to be done in stages or through successive malformities would be the electric eel. The electric eel generates electricity and stuns its prey or defends itself, and its specialized eggs that produce electricity, called electrolytes, are highly complex and seem unlikely to happen by accident, at least not ending the species. So my question was examples that would have ended the species if it had done in stages, and there's quite a few of them. So to avoid it, I'm going to post what proponents of evolutionary theory want to use as a counter argument. And still, you got to think of the A, B, and C, and looking at the B part of the logic. Incremental advantages. There's small steps in development. So incremental is one thing, but when the incremental advantage would necessarily cause its extinction, the idea that a little tiny things migrate, like the lump in the creature's throat, that became a draft, to do it 6 times, but the idea that logically, and it wouldn't have a longer neck to begin with, that a lump in the throat would do anything positive and be reproduced into its offspring, it just seems fundamentally stupid. It says co-option. Evolution often repurposes existing structures for a new function. Yeah, but still, I think the argument of whether that new structure would kill it or allow it not to be passed on. I mean, once something dies, it can't pass on that distinction. So there's a fish that has a little tiny tongue look that looks like a small fish. It looks like the tail end of a small fish. It sits there with its mouth open, and a fish comes in because he thinks it's a fish and bites at it, and then closes. But to think that happened by accident, okay, maybe something weird in his little tongue. But how did it start to look like another fish? How would it know that its own tongue looked like another fish? That's just sort of a strange analogy. Time and scale. Okay, now this one I think works against the idea of evolution. They say, their argument is, well, over billions of years, all this can happen. Well, no, time and some of these changes, there are some chemical changes that have time limits. And so for it to change from one thing to another, or even life to exist, those enzymes and those various proteins, they have time limits to where they're viable. So not only does it have to happen, it has to happen over and over again. And changes not just in one animal, but it would have to be passed on to their DNA. Now, I know there are ways of doing that, and I know what they are, so you don't have to tell me. But it just seems like the improbability of Darwin's math, or Darwin's theory, or even the latest revelations of this. Oh, look at this. One more thing, too. So they think the relative age of things. If it's not biological, they look at where it is in the structure. And I remember reading this article, and they had this it's a lattice of a protein as a fossil, and they had it in a section of the stratus. So they said, oh, this thing is billions of years old, and they had an exact date, based on this, where it is. But somebody, and it was like an off comment, this scientist said, well, if you look at this rock, it could have rolled down into the lake, and it could have, and so it made a 400 million year difference. So a lot of this stuff is considered in, there are archaeologists and paleontologists who say that a lot of the human changes are in a 70,000 year or 70 million year space, and in a very recent, our species is in a very small space of time all over the world. So that kind of like, time works against this stuff, not for it. So that's the third of their arguments. So this one is the cost of complexity. It takes a great deal of interior resources to make these changes that are being hypothesized, but it also doesn't, it takes a great deal of resources for this to happen, and so environmental changes and resource shortages are not accounted for, making it less likely that that species or that creature would continue and reproduce. So here are some more ideas to think about. There's a thing called maladaptive traits. Maladaptive traits are natural structures work on the principle of advantage traits that are passed down. Now, my argument with the draft was that each and every blood clot or valve, putting it nicely, could and probably would cause the death of the creature first. There's also another one that talk about you have a species that's really dependent on a specific food source. That what happens if that food source changes, and that maladaptive trait would then cause that species to go extinct and overdo its resources, even eat itself to scarcity. So that's maladaptive traits. Okay, so this one I didn't think about. It's called runaway traits. It's some traits of these creatures are just for reproduction, to attract a mate. The peacock's tail is given as an example, and how that to a predator would cause risk over these long adaptation periods that they're saying that these manipulations of the DNA happened. So and there's a terms of energy, there's a terms of mobility for this creature to survive. So there's environmental changes, and so they use that as an example of why one creature might mutate into another creature. However, it could also work against them. Many environmental conditions change rapidly or change very slowly. However, slowly you could see that it might adapt, that the creatures that have that adaptation would progress as a species, but they rarely would go that slowly. Ice ages and others have been known to go very fast. They have mastodons with grass in their stomach that are frozen solid, and it takes extreme weather changes. And so that would also work against the idea of Darwinian mutations.
Please like and subscribe.